Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is David Kasher. I'm a rabbi at IKAR, and this is an IKAR program. This is our speaker series. We have one every year, and I see Lisa's here. Lisa and the Lisa and Maury Friedman Foundation sponsors this speaker series, so we're very grateful for that. An opportunity to really think deeply about a topic and bring in some of the people we trust most, the experts on the theme. And the theme this year is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we've done a couple of the sessions so far. And today we're going to head into one that I'm happy to be a part of because it's very near and dear to me and to my heart. We're going to be looking at disability inclusion in, first of all, just as a general concept, but we have the opportunity to look at it, and the reason for this series is to think about, well, how does that affect our community and Jewish community as a whole? But I mean, IKAR is really doing this series in part because we're trying to figure out how to be a more inclusive community. So I'm excited today because we have both a real expert on the topic, the expert on the topic, and also someone who happens to have moved to Los Angeles recently and become a beloved member of our community. So we have first of all, our friend and fellow prayer, Matan Koch. But Matan is the vice president for workforce and missing one more workforce and faith programs at Respectability, an organization that
workforce leadership and faith programs.
Leadership and faith programs at Respectability, but Matan is also we're going to hear a little bit about Respectability and the work that they do soon. But I just want to flag that Matan is also, if you can just hear by his name, Matan. Right, Matan grew up deeply Jewish. So he's a rabbi's kid and a scholar in his own right, and has a real command for the sources in our own tradition that reflect on disability rights or the lack thereof. And so I'm really excited as someone who's cares about our community, but also is informed by our tradition and our Torah to be able to do both things at once, to think about this issue broadly and to think about it in the Jewish context. So with all that said, I want to thank our interpreter who's here, and to say that we've had an interpreter for all of these sessions. And tonight I'm especially happy because of the topic, and because, as I said, the topic is near and dear to me, in part because my mother, who is here, is deaf, and I've thought a lot about disability in the Jewish community and how that's played out in our family and in that particular disability. But obviously we're going to look at a very broad picture today. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Matan Koch, the Vice President for Workforce, Leadership, and Faith programs at Respectability. And I guess I would like to start, Matan, just by, first of all, welcoming you, and just like we do in shul every week, and I love you and good to see you, but also welcoming you as the Vice President in this organization. I'd love to hear you tell us a little bit about Respectability and what it is that you do, what your work is there at that organization.
Thank you, Rabbi Kasher. And let me say that it's really just delightful for me. I mean, yes, I give these kind of talks for a living, but also, yes, it's really a special pleasure to be able to do it in my own community and, have that moment of the sort of IKAR ethos of we all contribute to our community. So thank you for that opportunity. And so I would say that Respectability, well, our mission statement, we'll start there. We fight stigmas and advance opportunities so that people with disabilities can participate in, can give their talents to all aspects of society. We were founded as an outgrowth of the Jewish Funders Network interest group on disability about 8-9 years ago now. Time just keeps going by. But quite immediately, after we were founded, our founders really took stock, and especially our president, Jennifer Leslie Mizrahi, took stock and said, you know what? The biggest issues facing Jews with disabilities are not whether they can get to shul. The biggest issues facing Jews with disabilities are they need jobs and they need housing and we need, because actually about 90% of our staff, 87% of our staff are people with disabilities. We need, jobs, we need housing, we need for the portrayals of us in society and the perceptions of us in society to be accurate, not always positive, because there are good people with disabilities, bad people with disabilities, and everywhere in between, where just like everyone else, really. And we are, in fact, 1 in 5 of all people and 1 in 4 of all adults. So not only are we just like everyone else, we kind of are everyone else, right? There are 33 people on this Zoom right now, so it says down there. And so statistically, 8 of the people on this Zoom are people with disabilities. Now, because we're all adults. So, and just found out another 17 on Facebook. So statistically, there's probably about 12 people with disabilities actively participating because as one gets to adults, again, that number gets to 25%. And so what does respectability do? We really do 3 things. Number 1, we make sure that the world's perception of people with disabilities is accurate to remove the stigma that comes with having a disability. And a huge portion of that work, and the reason that we find that our largest concentration of staff is in Los Angeles, is working with Hollywood and working with studios and working with media companies so that the portrayals of individuals with disabilities that you see on screen are accurate. And we found that the best way to make sure that they are accurate is to make sure that the talent, especially the talent behind the camera, is in fact reflective of people with disabilities. So, 2 of our program areas are consulting with the studios themselves, but also a yearly lab program where we basically find 30 top flight behind the camera professionals with disabilities, really who should already have great jobs in the studio system, but don't, because people with disabilities don't always have that entree. And essentially for 8 weeks, studios come in and ostensibly they're teaching them useful skills, and they are, but the biggest thing is we're exposing those studios to the talent that we have, and then they're getting incredibly talented people with disabilities there are who want to tell their stories. The second bucket of our work is what we call our policy and practices work. And what that really means is making sure that organizations, be it Jewish organizations, secular organizations, nonprofits, businesses, are implementing best practices for people with disabilities, and that where there's an intersection with government, which is often government funds that are being used ostensibly to advance the progress of people with disabilities, that those that the policies that are around those monies and those programs line up with the real needs and lived experience of people with disabilities. And then the third element of our program is what we call our leadership pipeline. And our leadership pipeline is simple and profound. It's simple in that we train people to be the next leaders with disabilities, to have seats at the tables, to have the skills. That is simple. What is profound is it's the recognition of the need to grow. I will be 40 in a couple of months. There are folks at the organization who have a couple of decades on me. There are folks younger too, but we recognize we will not be around forever, and we need to make sure that the next generation of leaders is bigger, better, and even more able to make progress. And we need to make sure that folks that maybe aren't so young in a chronological sense, but have not embraced their leadership yet, are adding to the ranks of leaders while we still have their wisdom to draw from. And so our leadership pipeline programs are squarely designed to increase that. And the main area we do that is in the space of nonprofit leadership, both Jewish and secular, just because we find that we're not as well equipped as a nonprofit to place people as leaders in the for-profit sector, not because we have anything against the for-profit sector. Many of our board are people with disabilities from the for-profit sector, but we have found that is our sweet spot. So that was a slightly long description, but I think it was useful.
No, that was useful. That gives us a good sense of the work, and it's clearly important work. I mean, it's important not just because of the value, but also important in the sense that it's the kind of work that if you're not doing it, it's not getting done. You know, it's like it's really vital in that sense. That sets us up nicely to think about, okay, so what do we do in our Jewish community and how? But I want to do this a little out of order. I want to kind of put a pause there and plan to get back to what that means for us. Because I want to, as we begin to think about the Jewish community and our own community here at IKAR, I want to do something you're uniquely capable of doing, which is to kind of go all the way back and just think, wait a minute, okay, so what is the Jewish community's relationship to disability altogether? And what are the values that inform that relationship and how does it play out? So I'd like to just kind of go all the way back and ask you, you know, what does the Torah say about disability? You know, what does our tradition say about disability? But let's start with the Torah, because I have some sense that, you know, I mean, Moses had a disability, so that's kind of prominent, and there are lines in there like, oh, you know, don't put a stumbling block before the blind. But on the other hand, I do have some sense that disability is stigmatized, and that, you know, a priest who is who can't walk or is disabled in some other way can't serve as a priest. So I have a sense that maybe disability is not really accorded much in the way of rights and status in our most ancient traditions. So I'm curious, how, like, what would you say about that? What is the Torah's position, so to speak, on disability?
Well, it's funny, as you were just telling me before we let everyone in out of the waiting room, it's always hard to say what is the Torah's position on anything, right? The Torah has multitudes of positions, but I think in this question specifically, there's a very strong tension, and you've actually identified the two pieces of the tension in your question, but let's unpack them a little bit. On the one hand, there are these simple prohibitions. You know, people with various physical disabilities cannot serve. If they are of the priestly class, they cannot serve as priests. And that, of course, is immediately troubling, right? That what to do. And yet, the best answer that I've ever seen to what that really is about comes from the late Rabbi Judith Abrams, who wrote on this topic and spoke on this topic. And what she said was, we had to understand the conception of the mind of the time, and that in the mind of the time, holiness or the presence of God was quite literally a potentially lethal thing, right? I mean, think about the strange fire of Nadav and Avihu. You know, think about all the ways where if you go into temple service wrong, you die because it's a deadly place. And so she posited, and I like this because it fits with the rest of the values in the Torah, she posited that those prohibitions were simply because they were worried that those bodies could not physically stand up to the lethally holy environment that they envisioned the temple to be. And the proof text for this notion is that if you look, and I mean, I haven't really deeply delved into, I don't think the Torah itself gets into it, but if you look at the way the Talmud unpacks some of these questions just a little, it makes a clear point that while priests with disabilities could not have performed temple service, they had all the prerequisites, honors, and you know, kavod, as it were, honor that goes to members of the priestly class. So there's sort of that proof text that says, all right, we can't put them in a place that's unsafe, much less we wouldn't, have me be the bailing person on a boat since I can't swim, but we give honor. And I think that fits nicely with what I think of as the truer biblical conception of disability, which, as you point out, is the fact that Moses is the person with a disability. But it's not just that, because that in isolation would be fun fact. Did you know that Moses had a disability? Oh, isn't that neat? But rather, I like to unpack the notion. So set the scene. A bush is burning, it's not being consumed. Most of the people on this call probably remember that scene, and they probably remember that we had a whole discussion about Moses and his shoes. But somewhere beyond Moses and his shoes, God says, Moses, this is what I want you to do. And Moses says, Nami, I don't speak very well. Literally, I'm heavy of mouth and tongue. Pick somebody else. And God says, no, I made you exactly who you are. Who made you this way? Me. I know exactly who you are. And you are the person that I want. And Moses is a little more, I don't know. I'm really afraid. I don't think I can do it. Wow, not me. And so, all right, your brother Aaron can do some speaking for you. And we learn so much from these few lines, right? Because first we have Moses. Keep in mind, for a prince of Egypt, someone who'd been raised in a palace, but because stigma is what it is, his first thought upon being virtual leadership is, I can't do this. I don't talk well. I have a disability. You don't mean me. God says, no, I made you who you are, and you're exactly what I want. And that's such an interesting perspective, because it leads to this notion that I always think of as two notions. Number one, that Moses' talents were exactly perfect for the job, but also that in Moses' case, for whatever reason, even the disability was a part of what made him the perfect person for the job. Now, I can only speculate as to what that might be. Is it that it allowed a certain amount of humility to balance the lofty upbringing that came from? I have no idea what it is, but I think that the biblical message is very clear. You are exactly who I want for this. You're the right person. But then we immediately see compassion. We see compassion for the fact that this is a hard journey for anyone with a disability to take, that acceptance, that love that God intrinsically has for Moses is much harder for Moses to have for himself. And so God says, okay, till you get to that comfortable place, I'm not mean, I love you, I care about you, here's Aaron, right? And we know that this is intended as temporary. How do we know that the entire book of Deuteronomy, Moses is basically talking for himself, right? So like at some point before it's all over, we have Moses the orator, we have Moses the speaker, we have Moses the poet. So this is really about Moses becoming comfortable with who he is and finding his voice within that. And all of that's right there in the Torah, right? Like I didn't have to, there's no midrash in anything I just said. I literally, everything I gave you straight up, you could find it in Tanakh, right? You could open up your book. I could point you to the line. In fact, on the source guides that we'll be distributing to anyone who's here today after they are published, I give the actual chapter and verse where you can find these things. So you can find them yourself, and they're right there.
Okay, great. So they're right there, but they need just did a beautiful excavation, and they need a little excavating. I mean, it's great because it's right. It's this week's Parsha, right? This week's Parsha is like Moses spoke these words, and Moses is the person who said, Lo ish devarim anochi. I'm not a man of words, right? So it's like I see the transformation, the evolution that you're talking about in the Torah, but it's still a poetic. As you suggest, the Torah leaves itself ambiguous, as it often does, and it suggests things poetically. So on the one hand, we have this narrative, but on the other hand, we have some, when it comes to real practical law, and for reasons that you are putting into context, and maybe a context of holiness being just a dangerous force that one needs to protect rather than bar people from, what ends up happening, what ends up playing out is legally, it doesn't seem like the Torah does a lot of work to quote unquote ensure disability rights. And then along the way, you mentioned the Talmud. And my sense in my conversations with you about this is that the Talmud, now just to give people a little context, the Torah is a book that different theories on how it appears, but it appears many centuries before the Common Era. Whereas the Talmud is the rabbinic legal code that gets put together at the end of the 3rd century of the Common Era. So many, many centuries later, the birth of rabbinic Judaism. And from my conversations with you, Matan, I have this sense that the Talmud really represents a paradigm shift or a kind of an advancement, a new way of thinking about disability, and maybe even beginning to think about disability rights. So can you take us a little bit into that? Like how does this conversation move forward in what we call the rabbinic period or the Talmudic period?
Well, I thank you for asking. And I really think that there are 3 quick Talmudic examples that are going to really illuminate what I think is the implied theme around that whole lethal holiness conversation, which is that the rabbis, at the very least, did not see disability as inherently limiting. It was that they were wrestling with their realities of what they understood and the realities of human nature and what they perceived as the realities of disability. So I'm going to give 3 examples that show us that. The first is perhaps the most straightforward, and it is a Talmudic analysis of exactly this question of who can bring offerings into the temple, who can separate offerings, which is a technical task of knowing the right stuff to bring in as an offering. And at first, what the Torah says is that someone who is, and this was a biblical category that they referred to as cheresh, which is usually translated as deaf mute, but which I like to translate as prelingually deaf in our current understanding of how they go, is not obligated to do this separation. Okay, and that's, as the rabbi pointed out, discriminatory sounding. And then, but we read right on, and they say, however, if the cheresh, if this person that we don't have a great translation for, which is why I'm using the Hebrew word, even though does successfully demonstrate that they know how to separate this particular offering, then it's a valid offering and they become a part of that offering tradition. And what that Talmud, what rabbis throughout the ages, like, this is not Matan, this is, people far wiser than me, have read that Talmudic discussion to mean is that the concern for the rabbis was that they had a terribly difficult time 1600 years ago educating folks that were born deaf. And so they did not want to put obligations on people that were born deaf to do things that they had no way to educate them how to do. But if it were demonstrated that in whatever way that person had gained the education, they knew how to appropriately separate the offering, then they were treated just as anyone else. That the real concern for the rabbis was, are they going to know how to do it? And so they were removing the obligation if they didn't know how to do it, and putting the obligation back if they did know how to do it. And that concept goes throughout. Similarly, is my favorite story, just because no one knows of it. And it is amazing, because I tell you, friends, it is an individualized education plan in the Talmud. Those who are not familiar, an individualized education plan is something required by law for students with disabilities, so that they can learn in the way that is appropriate to them. We often refer to a free and appropriate public education these days. That's a legal term. I am a lawyer in my first career, so sometimes I sound a little legalistic. But what is interesting is that there is an IEP right there in the Talmud. And so there's a story. And as the Talmud does in its stories, a stage is set. And what they say is, we know that there was a rabbi and a student. And we know that the way it was laid out, every time the rabbi taught this student, the rabbi needed to repeat the lesson 100 times, and then the student would grasp the lesson. Now, that's not the very best in special education. We've kind of figured out things better than 100-time repetition now, but you know, for 1,500 years ago, we'll call it downright innovative, right? And then, but the story goes on because the story wants to show us how important this is. So then the rabbi says, then the story says, one day the rabbi came into the lesson but announced that he was hurrying to perform a time-sensitive mitzvah. We don't even know what time-sensitive mitzvah it was. We just know that it was something that he had a Jewish legal obligation to do in a time-limited fashion, and he announced this to the student for whatever reason before starting the lesson. Still taught the student the 100 times. And after the 100 times of teaching had concluded, the student had not grasped the lesson. And the rabbi said to the student, I do not understand. Every time I teach you 100 times and then you grasp the lesson, and this time I taught you 100 times and you did not grasp the lesson. And the student said, Rabbi, before you started teaching the lesson, you told me that you had to perform a time-sensitive mitzvah. And so after each repetition, I worried that perhaps there would not be the next repetition, that perhaps you would have to leave to perform this time-sensitive mitzvah, and I couldn't concentrate, and I didn't learn, and that's why. And the Talmud tells us that the rabbi stopped, taught the lesson another 100 times, and then the student grasped the lesson. And what is so interesting there, Rabbi Kasher can back me up on the statement that the Talmud takes time-sensitive mitzvahs very serious. The Talmud is not casual about time-sensitive mitzvahs. Like in the world of the Talmud, that's a big deal. So the notion that with a time-sensitive mitzvah hanging over this rabbi's head, this rabbi not only taught the lesson 100 times, but taught an additional 100 times when the first 100 didn't take, before going on to perform this time-sensitive. It's a big indicator. It really says something. It talks about priority. The third one is the most nuanced, which is why I saved it for last, because I think it'll launch the rest of our conversation. You know, a little bit of thought goes into these things. I don't just ramble on. And so the third one I often like to think of as my favorite passage in the Talmud that is not a story, right? Because I just said I told you my favorite story, but now this is my favorite legalistic discussion in the Talmud. It's also incidentally what got me started in this field when I came across it by accident as a young undergrad in a Mishnah class, because I said, what? You know, and it threw me, and I decided I needed to learn more. And 25 years later, I apparently haven't looked back yet, but because I was a young undergrad. So there's this line in the Mishnah. First, before I go on, because I think this is a little important, does everyone on the call know what is Mishnah and what is Gemara, or should we give the brief version of what is Mishnah and what is Gemara?
Brief
So the
version,
Mishnah is a fairly terse legal code of rabbis opining at the beginning of the Common Era that somewhere around, what was it, 200, we believe, or we were told, was codified by an individual, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, and but it's terse, it's old-fashioned, it's in Hebrew, it's kind of hard to figure out what the Mishnah is saying. So for the next 400 years, lots of rabbis debated it, and they debated it in stylized discussions, and they debated it in houses of study. And they did this debate in two places. Those that did it in what was then Palestine, what is now the land of Israel, their debates were written down in what we call the Jerusalem Talmud. Those that did it in Babylon during the Babylonian exile was written down, we call it the Babylonian Talmud. And what we call those commentaries, that half that comes after the Mishnah, we call it Gemara. So you may hear me refer to Mishnah or Gemara if I don't think about the wording. What I'm really saying is the terse statement versus the debate and dialectic around what did it mean. And understanding those distinctions are kind of important to understand. So the Mishnah, the terse material, has a one-sentence statement. Well, I mean, it's a paragraph, but there's one sentence that specifically speaks to people with disabilities, and it says, a priest whose hands are malformed should not raise his hands in the Birkat Kohanim, in the priestly benediction. And it just says that, and I saw it, and I was floored again as a young guy with a disability, just sort of looking, what's that about, right?
And just to make that clear, I just reminded, like, the idea is like the priests do their thing, but if a priest has misformed hands, they wouldn't do that thing that we see priests do in front of the synagogue that they used to do on the dais in the temple.
And that was a very special thing, an obligation that was special to the priests. And so obviously, being a young person with a disability who was quite taken aback, I think I was all of 16 when I read this, I wanted to find out more. What was this about? And so, even though I did not read Aramaic at all, which is the language in which the Gemara, that part of the Talmud that I was talking about, is written, and I found the one existing translation at the time, now there are a few, and I read what they said, and what they said blew my mind. Because here's what they do. They run through this interesting analysis. They say, yeah, but what about so-and-so that lives in that town over there? Didn't he do it? And what about, and then they talk about other distractions. What about the guys with funny accents? Oh, wait, but if you're used to their funny accents, not a problem. And then they said, oh, wait, but what about, the people whose hands are deformed, if you will, because of their profession? And it's like, well, but if everyone in town has that profession, not a problem. So what we learn when we read through is that the theme that they offer is that they weren't actually concerned with people with deformed hands of some kind, or some sort of hand-related, disability or what have you, leading this prayer. They were worried about the distraction of the unfamiliar upon the community. That, in fact, whereas what you're supposed to do when the priests raise their hands is look down, look away, and sort of focus on the holiness of that moment, people would be distracted by hands that were different and would thus not themselves behave appropriately. And this, which leads us to this interesting question. Since we know, and I don't think we want to go into that particular source today, but since we know, well, I could tell you from another place that it's the obligation of every Jew to help every other Jew be the best Jews that they can be, however we want to describe that. And since we know that what allows Jews with disabilities to perform this sacred duty is for the community to expand its definition of what is normal, what is usual, what is not distracting to them, but what rather they accept as part of their own, we essentially learn from the Talmud itself that we have an obligation to expand our vision of who our leaders are to include those Jews that are different from us by reason of disability, by reason of lots of other things. It's essentially a notion that says that the obligation is on us to get our perception to a place where we're not distracted. And I want to be very clear. I think the rabbis understood human nature very well. So the rabbis didn't say, pretend you're not distracted. The rabbis didn't say, live with it, deal with it. The idea was that you had to get yourself to a place where for you this was commonplace. And that requires work on ourselves. We don't just get there by deciding one day, you know what, suddenly I am totally comfortable with everyone who's different from me. We actually have to work on it. We have to get to know the other. We have to have conversations like this where the other becomes ever more one of us. And I think not because they change, but because we slowly expand our definition of what one of us means. And I think this whole series is about DEI, and to my mind, that is one of the core pieces of DEI. DEI is not about melting pots or getting folks that have previously that we felt were different from us to be like us. And DEI is not about tolerating where we say, oh yeah, they're different, but we're going to put up with that because we're such great people. DEI is really about expanding our vision of us to the place where all of the differences and multitudes and wonder that make up humanity are in fact part of us. And I need to speak to another Talmudic source that really explains that. So we all have probably seen the biblical line that says that humanity was created in the image of God, right? Have we all seen that? And the rabbis ask the question, well, if everyone was created in the image of God, why do we all look so different? You know, why are we in fact, and the best answer that they can come up with is sort of like, the image of God is so much bigger than any one of us that we are all facets of the image of God, that only in the totality of us is actually reflected the image of God. But that means that the real exercise in expanding the us in DEI is to expand our image of ourselves to make full room for the image of God in our community. And that is what we do when we remove these barriers, the way the Talmud in the first passage I was talking about puts that onus on us. So that's my short version. Not very short, but a version.
No, I mean, I think you've taken us there. That is, you've convinced me. I mean, convinced me not only that there's a core of our kind of a subtext in the Torah itself that suggests the kind of inherent dignity of a disabled person. And now I see how you kind of brought that into the fullness of Jewish law by taking us through those Talmudic sensitivities. And you've convinced me that the rabbis' default instinct is not to just exclude, but actually that they might actually be working to include up against the laws that they feel are binding, or the circumstances they feel they have no other kind of like structure to think through. But okay, so that's good. That's the background. That's like the history. That's our inheritance. Now let's think a little bit about how that plays out in our communities. And I want to start actually with a personal example, because sure. When your first example was chereshot v'katan, like the deaf person or the deaf mute, the prelingual deaf person, the shote, like they often translate as fool, but someone who's not mentally capable, and then a child. And that, as you explained, that sort of grouping presumes that the common denominator is we don't have access to their dot. We don't know if they're understanding, right? So that, I mean, you mentioned it in terms of one mitzvah, but that in Jewish law often is understood to mean, oh, a deaf person is just not obligated in the mitzvot. And then I have some sense that because of the kind of the nuances in that Talmudic discussion, that changes over the years. And because, it's in my family, I'm aware of later voices that say, oh no, now that we have sign language, deaf people can be understood, and that changes the whole paradigm. But the example I want to give from my own life is that, I just had like a really terrible experience once where my father had passed away, and we were having shiva for my father. My father was deaf. And we're gathering together, in this, and my father was really traditional, lived in a Hasidic community, and we're gathered together and we're about to start the prayers, and someone says, oh, no, we can't start the prayers because 3 of the people in the room were deaf. And this person was saying, we can't count those people towards our minyan. Now, it was just sort of an appalling, and I was just sort of, I was speechless, like, here we are, my father who was deaf, his shiva, and somebody is saying, stop the ceremony because deaf people are here and we can't count them. And at the moment, I had some vague sense like, that's not the only way to look at it. But I was like 23, and this guy he had big payas and a lot of authority, and he was taking from the most traditional, or let's not even say the most traditional, the most restrictive is really like the way to put it, most restrictive understanding of that formulation. So there's an example of how in real Jewish practice, whatever rabbinic sensitivities or openness or evolution of the concept throughout the year, sometimes we find ourselves in a community where people are just not sensitive to that, and maybe ignorant of it, or maybe even resistant to it. What do we like? What do I do in that circumstance? What do we do in those circumstances? That's my family's sort of disability signal point, but obviously there are so many examples that we could think through in similar ways. So I want to begin to think with you about, so what do we do about the fact that the Jewish community hasn't really caught up to the kinds of nuances and openness that you're suggesting?
And so I'm glad you asked the question, because that is really the work that took up my time for a solid 7 years before respectability snapped me up to the job that I do now, was a deep focus on that. And so after a lot of work on that, here are what conclusions I've been able to come up with. And this is just my observations. I don't have the found wisdom of, the 1,000-year Talmud behind me to say this, but, I've been around a little bit, is the following. I would never use the Talmud as my persuasive tool. I mean, maybe if you were going to a Beit Din, if you're going to a rabbinic court and you were trying to change their mind, that's the place to use the Talmud as a rabbinic tool, but as a persuasive tool. But here's rather what I think. The only way you're going to change minds and hearts is if folks actually want to bring people with disabilities in their midst. The Talmud is a fantastic way, and I used to work with observant congregations and less observant congregations and non-observant congregations all throughout the spectrum. And the Talmud is really important to know, so that someone says, we want to, but halacha won't let us. Then you can turn around and say, well, actually, right? So let's change mildly your story from the actual facts that happened to you to what could have happened. And let's just say, what if someone had said, instead of telling them, oh, we can't count them, what actually happened? Someone said, oh, we'd really love to count them, but I think we're halachically constrained from doing so. Then you have the opportunity to say, well, actually, isn't it nice to know the halacha does not so constrain you? But in order to get the places where someone is like that, you have to get them excited. When I give a standard Bima talk about trying to get a congregation interested in this in the first instance, I don't talk about the Talmud. I probably don't make much reference to Moses tonight, because I know this is an IKAR audience, and an IKAR audience wants to get into all that. But when I'm starting from the beginning, what I do is I pose the following idea. I have been in the Jewish community pretty much since the day I was born. As the rabbi mentioned, my father was a rabbi, my mother a professional Jewish educator, my sister's a rabbi, my brother's been an educator, my other sister's the president of her shul, and then me, and one little brother that doesn't seem to do a lot of Jewish stuff, but that's up to him. But so I've been deeply immersed in this stuff for a really long time. And because I have had access, most of which granted to me because of the force of personality and reputation that my parents had at their disposal, the Jewish community has benefited, right? I've been a Hillel leader. I've been a synagogue leader. I've led hundreds and hundreds of services for communities that didn't have a rabbi to do it or didn't want it wasn't their model for a rabbi to do it. You know, I've served on boards of countless Jewish organizations. Now I work as a Jewish professional part of the time. I hope that the Jewish community has benefited from my presence, even if not as much as I have benefited from my involvement, but at least some portion of it, right? And so after laying that out, I posit the following thing. You never know who's going to be the most important person in your Jewish experience. And I would wager, again, not with ego, but just with fact, I would wager that there's at least some people that would put me on that list for their lives, even as I assume there are some people who would put each of you on that list for their lives. We each have different people that are our people. But now I want you to posit something. Think of your person, whoever your person is, that person that really makes shul or makes Jewish life, or whatever, right? And I'm going to use shul as the example because it makes the point easier to make. Now let's imagine that you know them from shul here in Los Angeles. Again, it just makes the story easier. And let's imagine that they were not born in Los Angeles, but like me, they moved to Los Angeles later in life. So if they were like me and they moved to Los Angeles later in life, they probably did what we like to call shul shopping, right? They didn't just go one place. They went a bunch of places. And now you're going to find out that I'm a science fiction geek, because as a science fiction geek, I love the concept of alternate timelines. And we're about to play the alternate timeline game. So in timeline alpha, the timeline in which we find ourselves, they made a list of shuls that they wanted to try. And they got to IKAR, and IKAR was so fantastic that they just never made it to the rest of the list. It wasn't anything against the rest of the list. It's just IKAR blew their minds, and there we go.
I like that
right?
narrative.
I thought you might, but now let's look at alternative timeline beta, which is that on that day they were going to go check out IKAR. They got a flat tire. So they davened at home. And maybe they really liked their list. So they had every plan to go back to IKAR when their list got to the finish. But the next week they were going to Beth Am. And I just picked Beth Am because a lot of people happen to be members of both IKAR and Beth Am, which makes it a good example to use for this purpose. And they go to Beth Am and they think it's fantastic, right? And they like it so much that they never come to us. Not because they had anything against IKAR, but because Beth Am made them cancel the rest of their list before they got to us. You would have never met that person who is your person because of a flat tire. Now think of a barrier to inclusion as a flat tire. Think of the person who is deaf, arrives at shul, sees there's no interpreter, turns around and walks away as a version of that flat tire. Think of the person who's mobility impaired, arrives at shul, finds a flight of stairs, gets turned away as that flat tire. Think of that person who lives with a condition that makes them move or act slightly differently than other folks, who gets to shul, starts being themselves, experiences the censorship of the community, and walks away as that flat tire. In timeline alpha, where there was no flat tire, where the shul is accepting, you got your person. Your person just happens to have a disability. In timeline beta, you lost out on that person. And that's where I start people, because halacha is not going to get people to do it. I want them thinking about who they're missing by closing the door. And now I saw the rabbi said it's time for us to open to questions. I'm thrilled with that because more than anything, I want to answer your questions. I'm going to ask you to put those questions in the chat, and then we will address them.
Yeah, I want to open it up for questions. It's worked best for us in the past for you to type them in the chat, and then I'll read them as they come out. I just want to thank you for that, Matan. I'm still I'm really taking that in. That in a sense we potentially lose Moses. We might miss our prophet if we're it's not about letting people in. It's who knows where Moses is standing and how we'll miss Moses if we get that flat tire. So I really appreciate that. All right, let's see what is going on here in the chat. I'm not seeing anything. I did see that my mother, honor your mother and father. I'll let my mother go first. Do you want to sign? Do you prefer to sign just because there's an interpreter here? If you want to sign, go ahead. Okay. So I'll let the interpreter speak this out. Yeah.
Yeah, I've really learned a lot from this, and I'm so surprised in what you believe, what you've gone through in your life. It's so much like me. It's been the same with me. And it's been absolutely amazing when you talk about Moses having a disability. What disability did Moses have?
Great. So we don't precisely know what Moses' disability was. What we know is that Moses self-describes as chvad peh uchvad lishon, which literally means heavy of mouth and tongue, which we assume was some kind of speech impediment. But there is actually endless midrash trying to decide what that actually means. So I cannot give one definitive answer. Everything from a midrash that says he burned his mouth on a hot coal to lots of others. So, but we know that it was some kind of speech impediment.
Great.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mom. Other folks, questions from the floor? Questions in the chat? Okay. Florine Rosen, I feel the main issue is not understanding the concept of soul speak. We first respect another soul as a being of divine image and a recipient of light. This is before verbal interpretation. Does this need to be addressed more? Florine, so very, very spiritual language there, but how would you respond to that, Matan?
Well, I mean, I'm not, again, so I'm going to take it from the spiritual language into the practical. I'm no expert on what is soul, what is personality, what is, those are questions I leave for the theologians. And while I have a degree in theology, I was never very good at it. So, so we'll step aside the actual question of what it comes from and say that I do agree that the first step is that deep appreciation of people for who they are. Now, if we call that soul and we call that appreciation of soul speak, great. If we call that personality, great. If we call that divine spark, great. If we call that a facet of the image of God, all the more. I don't care if we call it tuna fish, although I'm not sure why we would, as long as we recognize the inherent beauty, power, and value that comes from each person. Does that sort of answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's a good first pass at it. It's a deep question, right? So we could keep thinking about it. The next question is a little more practical, and Alexandra asks, how does a community know they're succeeding at being inclusive? And I'm thinking about IKAR here. One of the things I want to get from you is just give us some pointers, give us some tips. We want to be a more inclusive community in every respect. And yet, when it comes to disability inclusion, what are we missing? What do we do next? How do we measure ourselves on that scale?
All right, so let's unpack that a little bit. First of all, on the purely technical side, I actually don't think we need to talk about it here because your team avidly consumes all of the technical guidance that we put out on that. Andrea, who is running this Zoom for us, reads the stuff I write as if someone actually were interested to write it. So to read it. So it's like very, so I am not the least bit worried here about discussing the technical elements of inclusion. We can provide materials to anyone that wants, and IKAR eats those up. So that is great. What I do want to talk about is how we make our community more welcoming, because each of those tools, while valuable, is just a tool. And a tool is a means to an end, it's not the end, right? So let's leave aside the tools, and everything can be a tool. A ramp can be a tool. Captioning can be a tool, right? Let's leave all that aside. At the end of the day, what really matters to make a community inclusive is that you deep down want folks with barriers to participating, whether those are disability or any other barrier, to be a part of your community, and that you are willing to work with them to make that happen. So let me give a really concrete example, and we'll call it a tale of two shoals. The first is that, so this was both when I moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. When I first moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, I encountered one shoal that I thought I wanted to be a member of. And for a year, we were going back and forth on questions like, how am I going to get there? How can we work out transportation? Gee, I'm having technical challenges filling out the membership paperwork. And everyone is helpful, and everyone is nice, and everyone wanted to figure it out. But it just sort of kept going, right? Then it happened that someone bought me a ticket to an event at another shoal, I think because they really wanted me to try out something at their shoal, right? So I went to this other shoal, and I was quite impressed. And I said, and I happened to say, I went to Shabbos services, that week, because this had been a during the week event, but I went to Shabbos services that week to get a sense of what it was like. And I happened to mention that that this was an interesting show and that I might be interested in joining. It was a holiday weekend. I can't remember now whether it was Labor Day or Memorial Day, but it was some weekend when we had Monday off, right? And that was critical so that was Saturday morning that I expressed that interest. Monday midday, the membership chair was at my house, helping me fill out the application, helping me write a check from my checkbook, which is something that I can't do myself. Now I don't need to use checkbooks, but back then, things were a little more paper-based, helping me fill out the application, helping me write a check from my checkbook, and arranging the carpool rotation that would get me to shul every week. Within 2 days of my expression of desire to be a member of the shul. And that's it in a nutshell. It's not about what technical tools you have. You use the tools you've got. And when you're a community like IKAR that has access to fairly vast resources, if you need new tools, you get new tools. But what resources won't create is that willingness to say, let's use the tools we have and let's just make the barriers go away. Not, ooh, isn't that interesting? You're experiencing a barrier to participating in our community. Let's have a year's worth of discussions on it and try to figure out the best. Let's just make the barriers go away. And then let's continue to refine it. But the key is they got me to shul that next week. The key is it wasn't some months of talking before they figured out. And sure, we refined as the months went by. Absolutely. How could we not, right? And I will tell you, I moved out of Cincinnati, 16 years ago now. I still maintain a membership in that shul. It's a cheap out-of-town membership, but I still maintain a membership in that shul, even though I wasn't from Cincinnati and I only lived there for a couple of years, because when a place is as welcoming as all that, you want to remain a part. So you want to ask how to really, to do this right, it's to emulate that perspective. And then you want to ask how to measure. Look around when you're at shul. Do you see people that you're not used to seeing in other places? Do you say, wow, that's cool? Somehow it has become possible for them to be there. If you see that, you're succeeding. If you don't, by any other metric, I would respectfully say you failed, because I don't even care if you manage to get people on your membership rolls. If you never actually see them at your shul, you obviously haven't succeeded, because maybe they joined, maybe they want to be able to say I'm a member of something, but unless you actually see them participating in some way, you clearly have not removed the barriers to participation, because nobody joins something they don't want to participate in some way. We all participate differently. For some people, it may be class. For some people, it may be davening. For some people, it may be social justice. But, you know, I believe that that is how we answer that question.
That's great. That's really helpful. We're past 7, and I want to just do just looking at the list here of questions. I want to take a couple more questions. Some of them synthesize some of the other questions that were asked. One builds right on the point you were just making, which is let's see here. Nancy Brunn asked on Facebook about how you think things would change if there were Jewish spaces with people with disabilities at the center and everyone else invited to follow along. And part of the way I understand that question is you're talking about are people with disabilities present? And in some ways, Nancy's question pushes it a step further and says, well, what about, and this is a word we often use in these DEI conversations, what about representation? Like, should we be deliberate about foregrounding people with, rabbis with disabilities and, prayer leaders with disabilities, like making sure in a sense to have that visual representation in order to not just so that they're present, but to communicate, yes, your leaders, your people, you up at the front, that's an important thing. Like, do you think along those lines as well, representation?
So first of all, the short answer is yes, but there's a longer answer. The longer answer is, as I think I've mentioned now twice in the conversation, disability represents 1 in 4 Jewish adults. It just has to, statistically. That is the number. And so that I would flip it and say, if you don't have at least 1 in 4 representation in all of those places, obviously something's keeping them out. And sometimes the things keeping them out are simple. If you do every aliyah up a flight of stairs, it's not surprising. My favorite story in this regard, I have a friend, he's a wheelchair user and he's an advocate on these issues. And one day he went to a synagogue in New York that at least at that time had no wheelchair access. I have no idea if they've changed since then. This was 20 years ago. But so he pulled himself up the stairs, arm over arm, to meet with the rabbi. And he said, Rabbi, I'm concerned there is no accessible access to your synagogue. And the rabbi said, oh, that's okay. We don't have people in wheelchairs in this community. And my friend looked at him and said, well, why do you think that is? Because nobody else was going to take the time to pull themselves hand over hand up the flight of stairs. Just ask the rabbi the question of why it is that you can't go up. So I think we need to flip the representation question and say, if we were doing it right, the representation would be 1 in 4. So if the representation is nowhere near 1 in 4, and Respectability did a survey in 2018 of some 7,000 or 8,000 Jews across the country, and only 15% of them could name a single communal leader with a disability, clearly we're doing something wrong when that's what the numbers reflect. And that's why one of Respectability's leadership pipeline areas, I mentioned leadership pipeline, does specifically focus on more Jewish leaders, because we do believe that that is an important issue. It's representation in part because it busts stigma, and that figures right into what we do in our Hollywood work. But it's also representation because representation should occur naturally. Why aren't there more rabbis with disabilities? Well, I will tell you, I was admitted to rabbinical school and they couldn't work out my accommodation needs. How many people that don't have my unique set of connections don't even get so far as admissions, right? So when we fix the problems, representation is going to happen. That said, conversely, the only real impetus to fix the problems comes when there's some representation. Because again, you look at some of the leaders that are there. My friend Rabbi Lauren Tuckman, the nation's first blind female rabbi. My friend Rabbi Darby Lay, a deaf rabbi. You look at those folks and you say, I want more people like that. I want my community to have a killer leader like that. So representation matters because that's what gets people clamoring at the bit for more.
Yeah, very well said. Let me ask you one last question, and I think it's an important just thing that we not forget, and then I'll turn it over to you for any last thoughts. But one of the questions we have here from Diana has to do with disabilities around, oh, sorry, no, I'm thinking of a different comment here. Where's the comment? Gail, sorry. Gail asks, do you have any particular strategies to facilitate inclusion of people with mental health challenges as opposed to physical challenges? My observation, she says, is that it's harder to accomplish. And Lawrence wrote about like biblical characters that might have had developmental delays, and there are other comments in there about mental disabilities. And so, yeah, so I think that is an important thing to make sure we cover before we leave. How does that fit into your work? And is it quite different, or is it very much the same conversation?
I think it's very much the same conversation. Here's how I always answer this question. So let's break it down. First of all, please let us remember that anyone that is dealing with a mental illness or a mental health related disability, the shul is not going to replace proper medical supports, right? We have a serious shortage of good mental health care in this country, and I would be remiss to answer this question without first saying that it is critical, and we should all be putting our efforts, if we are Jews that care about such things, to making sure that we seriously and systematically address the shortage of appropriate mental health care in our country and in the world more broadly. But then let's step back and let's assume that we're not talking about an individual in crisis, because an individual in crisis needs medical help and we need to get that medical. But let's assume that we're talking about an individual that is living with a mental health disability and is in a relatively stable place with that, as I am. In addition to my physical disabilities, I have significant depression and anxiety, but I live with those and I move through the world with those, and I thrive in the way that I do with those, with proper therapy, medication support, and whatever else. But let's assume that's the individual that we're talking about. Well, some folks, you're never going to observe anything externally different. What you're going to get is occasional requests that don't make sense to you. Someone's going to say, can I sit right there, not right there? Or can I stand over here instead of standing? And if we train ourselves to just say yes, it doesn't actually matter what it is that prompted that request. We can honor it. Can I have a quiet place to step aside for it? What if we just practice the notion of yes, that we don't actually need to know why, that we don't actually need an explanation? Well, tell me why I ought to do that. No, we worry about that stuff in the law because the law is built as it is, and the law serves a gatekeeping function, but I never give a talk with an opportunity to say this, and here's my opportunity. In a house of worship, we don't do gatekeeping. We want to throw our gates wide open. So, just say yes. And then the next step is that there's a whole series of mental health lifestyles and realities that do cause someone to present differently, but really aren't hurting anybody. So the next thing that you need to do is accept people that are a little different than your normal. Expand your vision of us. I said this once already. Someone reacts a little differently than you're used to. Oh, that's part of us. Someone makes motions you're not accustomed to. Oh, that's part of us. Someone makes sounds you're not accustomed to. Oh, that's part of us. And again, in a lot of youth environments, we have people like get up and explain why, but for grown-ups, just accept that's part of us. And that if it were a danger to you, if it were a problem, someone else would be dealing with it. So if no one is stepping in to deal with an apparent problem, then it's probably just a person in their way of enjoying shul, and maybe you want to go up afterwards and say hello because you know that someone that presents a little differently is more likely to be ostracized by a community, and so you want to consciously fight that by going to meet that person who might, again, be the best shul friend you ever made if you can overcome your difference. And I do want to speak for a moment to what just popped up in the chat about intellectual disabilities. The reality is that in some ways, intellectual disabilities is the easiest answer because you just meet everyone where they are, right? You know, you meet everyone at the level that they can engage. If that means a simple language version of something rather than a complex language, well, there's a wonderful organization, Gateways, it's based in Boston, that produces great materials in that regard. If it means that someone's going to be humming instead of singing the words, then that. And I know someone has quoted my dear friend and the person I usually sit next to at IKAR, Rabbi Brad Arts, and who really, you know, focuses on the special Torah that folks have to offer. And I think, so that's the issue. You got to meet people where they are. You got to get them to a place of understanding. For each person, that's going to be different. It's interesting. I just signed off on this week's newsletter. One of my random jobs is that I have to sign off on Respectability's Jewish newsletter. And one of the articles in our Jewish newsletter that's coming out tomorrow, which, by the way, you should sign up for if you don't currently receive, it's called The Jewish Disability Perspective. One of the articles in tomorrow's Jewish Disability Perspective will be a profile of one of the speakers in our Speakers Bureau, and he is a man with Down syndrome who is also an Orthodox Jew. But if you read the profile, it's fascinating because he's a man with Down syndrome, but he teaches, he reads Torah, he's married. You can't assume a single thing about the man just because he happens to be a man with Down syndrome. You got to read about Shlomo and learn who is Shlomo. And the fact that one aspect of Shlomo is that there was a different way of meeting Shlomo where he was that made him a part of his Jewish community is just par for the course. And I'll tell you something. In some ways, like I said, intellectual disability is the easiest because people tend to wear on their sleeve, right, what it is that will help to meet them. But you should really be engaging with that exercise in every single person that walks through a door of your shul. How are we reaching? How are we connecting? How are we bringing this to you in a way that is meaningful? So we are now at 7:16, and we promised ourselves we would not go beyond 7:15.
Yeah. I suppose it's the right time to end, but you've ended in such an important place, and I think you've given us so much over this last hour. You're really holding so much experience and learning and wisdom on this. And but the thing I'm still processing is the way that you kind of reframe the entire conversation, right? To one that is not about how we can be inclusive or help or be compassionate, but actually one in which it's for our sake. Like we want Shlomo in the community. We need those resources. We need that wisdom. We need that insight. We need that Torah. Like, what would have happened if Moses had been ruled out because of his disability? What would have happened if Matan had been ruled out? Like, thank God we have Matan, because Matan is really, like, on this issue, Matan is our Moses. Like, Matan is really the person who's leading us forward. So thank you for being our Moses tonight, Matan, for being our Moses on this issue, and for expanding our consciousness.
And I thank you, and I thank the IKAR community for giving me a Jewish home in Los Angeles. You know, I moved here less than 2 years ago, right before the pandemic, and I happened to come to IKAR almost by accident. Not that it was not on my list, but it was the first Shabbos I had arrived, and my dear friends, Neshama Karlbach and Menachem Creditor, were the scholars in residence, the guests at IKAR that weekend, and they said, "Hey, Matan, we're in LA, we're at IKAR, why don't you come?" And it could have been that I arrived and just hung out with my friends. Instead, I arrived and was embraced by this wonderful community. And a year and 3/4 later, this community continues to be a wonderful home and a place. So I thank you for that profoundly.
Yeah, well, we thank you for that. It's wonderful being in community together.
Absolutely.
And that's the spirit of this whole conversation, this whole series, is how can we all be in community together? How can we open that community so that we can all benefit from each other's Torah? We certainly benefited from yours tonight, Matan. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody for being here. Thanks to our interpreter, Nicole. Thanks to Lisa for sponsoring. And we'll have one more event in this series. Stay tuned for that in August. And wonderful to see you all tonight. Thanks for joining and for learning with us all on this very important issue. Kol Tov.